Our guest is John Avlon, he himself not extreme, but the author of the book Wingnuts, How the Lunatic Fringe is Hijacking America. Good morning.
Good morning.
I read this book and I love this book. I think it's the people that you write about are unintentionally funny to me.
They are.
So, they're when Glenn Beck says, he's against paying taxes, so everything he learned was at the library because libraries are free, and he doesn't understand taxes support libraries, one has to laugh. But this is something I want to say to you, and I want to get your feedback on it. I think the major difference between the right-wing fringe and the left-wing fringe is that, as a rule, the right-wing fringe tends to be armed.
Well, you raise a good point, especially today. I mean, there are differences. I mean, I believe, as a matter of principle, that the far right and the far left can be equally insane. But I also believe that in the first year of the Obama administration, there's no question that the right has been more inflamed and extreme than the left. The one place I'd caution you on that is that if you look back to the 1960s, the far left groups at that time, the Black Panthers and others, the really radical anti-war / groups that became anti-American from the far left were more violent in that period of time than their right-wing corollaries. There were an astounding number, I think more than 1,000 bombings, arsons, shootings from far-left groups at that moment in history. So I think that's important to keep in mind. But in a snapshot of today's world, you're right, and that's what I call the hatriots, people who believe it's patriotic to hate the American president. These folks are rising right now, groups like the Oath Keepers and others, who are armed, who see themselves as defenders of the Constitution. But you've got a very troubling movements going on right now. People, in many cases, preparing for secession. There's a lot of craziness going on right now, especially on the far right.
This is something I've never understood. When Barack Obama became president, the NRA, said, well, there go your guns. And so there became an increase in the amount of bullets being sold. Bullets. Yep. Now, to my knowledge, and correct me if I'm wrong, Obama has not made a nano-inch of a move against guns.
You are exactly right. In fact,
and so they keep peddling this. This is my question. Why has no one among these people who go to Joe's Bullet Shop stop for a minute and go, nothing happened. Nothing.
Because we're not talking about reason. We're not even talking about policy. Politics is perception, and the folks on the extremes love to pump up hate in the cause of hyperpartisanship. That is part of their strategy. And we've heard a lot of these arguments going way back. I mean, it is back in the early 1960s, the John Birch Society and other groups, the specter of forced disarmament, and then followed by, creation of a one-world government and invasion of the U.S. by UN troops, something that was repeated by Alabama former judge and current gubernatorial candidate Roy Moore at the National Tea Party Convention in Nashville. That fear-based tactic, that fear-based appeal has been deployed by folks on the far right for decades. It is evidently effective. It is also totally disingenuous.
Yeah, and so now I want to talk about the CPAC. What is I don't know the answer to this. What's the progressive equivalent? God, what's wrong with me today? What's the progressive equivalent of CPAC?
There really isn't one, which is fascinating. The conservative movement has been really focused on really philosophical debates since the days of Bill Buckley, and they cultivate youth. They use money and organization. They debate books and ideas, and they leaven that with not a little bit of hyperpartisanship. And I was thinking the same thing when I was covering CPAC this weekend. I was noticing, you get groups of like-minded individuals together, and it always ends up reaffirming that old adage that, in a place where everybody thinks alike, nobody thinks very much. More troubling than that, though, and in all seriousness, is the way that this year we've seen consistently the fringe blur with the base. The fringe is more powerful than ever before, or that certainly in our recent history. And one of the themes that, if you walked around CPAC, the idea that President Obama is a socialist is considered conventional wisdom among that crowd. It is accepted as a given. More troubling is the speeches, if you listen to them over and over, they are totally convinced, as one speaker said, that conservative ideas are American ideas, conservative values are American values. And they've set up a whole self-reinforcing narrative where conservatives are defenders of America's heritage, they're defenders of liberty, and that makes President Obama and the Democrats, either explicitly or de facto, King George III and the British Redcoats. They have associated the American president with fundamentally, as they say, un-American ideas and ideals. That increases the anger and hyperpartisanship. That is a serious and very dangerous, in my mind, dynamic that's going on right now.
I was commenting on this. I thought this is interesting. You have Glenn Beck on the cover, Sarah Palin on the cover, and for your choice for left-wing fringe is Keith Olbermann. Is he a fringy to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at, for example, Glenn Beck infamously called the president racist. Well, Keith Olbermann, right before the Massachusetts Senate special election, called Senator Brown, or now Senator Brown, racist, homophobic, and a promoter of violence against women. That choice has been controversial among some comments I've gotten, but I think it is important, especially at this moment of hyperpartisanship we're in. The political culture has become so polarized that people have become reluctant to ever condemn the extremes on their own side, even when confronted with indelible evidence of it. And I think that ends up only adding to the problem. I mean, the extremes incite each other. The extremes, end up creating a dynamic where politics follows the lines of physics. Every action creates an equal and opposite reaction. And one of the things I think we need to do to take America back from the lunatic fringe is to have the courage to stand up to extremes on both sides. And again, not engaging in a false equivalency, because as I said, there's no question that the far right now is angrier and more insane than the left. But remember, if you go up to a guy, as I have, been covering the Tea Party protests, carrying a sign of comparing President Obama to Adolf Hitler, and you go up and you say, what are you trying to do? What are you saying? One of the things you'll hear time and time again is they started it. They compared President Bush to Hitler, and nobody condemned them. And I think that's the larger takeaway, is that we need to stop this cycle of hyperpartisanship and hate that we are in. And to do that, we need to call out extremes on both sides. And if you
But doesn't that sound like an 8-year-old to you? Doesn't it, he started it.
Yes, it
they did it first. So, it reminds me of my mother. So if Johnny jumped off a bridge, would you? I mean, it really does. It seems like that's something a 9-year-old would say.
You're absolutely right, but that is what's being said, and I think it is important though to figure out what's motivating these folks, what creates this dynamic, because we need to stop the cycle, and I'm firmly convinced. I mean, that if we have more Americans than ever declaring their independence from the extremes on both sides, more Americans are registering independent than ever before. Independent voters are the largest and fastest growing segment of the electorate. You had a recent poll out that said 93% of Americans believe that Washington is too partisan. Well, Washington must think that 93% of the country is stupid, because they keep trying to perpetuate this hyperpartisanship and making all kinds of arguments and excuses for it, often encouraged by partisan cheerleaders in the media. And I just think it's time for the moderate majority of Americans to stand up and say, stop, enough. The President of the United States, no matter who he or she is not equivalent to Hitler in any way, shape, or form. Stop throwing around terms like dictatorship and tyranny. It's insulting to the American experience and to the millions of people who've been murdered. We've got Iowa Congressman Steve King at CPAC got up and gave a speech comparing liberals and progressives to a list of genocidal dictators, including Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, and Castro. Well, what bothered me, and the reason I wrote about it at the time, was that no one in the crowd thought that was an outrageous, offensive statement. So that is a symptom of the cycle we're in. And it really, in the beginning of my book, I look at Bush derangement syndrome and the number of times that the president was compared to Hitler, not just by folks in the crowd, but by, Nobel Prize winners. It's important to say that some things are off limits, that we need to calm our very contorted civic.
I think Jon Stewart said it best when he said, look, Hitler was Hitler.
Yes.
Every time your boss doesn't give you a raise, he's not Hitler.